I'm so scared of like saying something totally false and just moving past it.
Yeah, but I mean, we correct ourselves within the podcast. It's fine. If we have to go back on something later, then we can do that too.
Yeah, no big deal. Thank you for tuning in. This is A Century in Cinema, a podcast where we recommend and discuss a new film chronologically, year by year, starting in 1920. I'm Arthur.
And I'm Andrew.
So when I came up with this idea, I gave myself a few criteria for the films that we're choosing. 1, each film had to be easily accessible. If we kind of treat this like a book club where you, the audience, can follow along, we weren't going to be choosing films that are only available on out-of-print DVDs. Most of the films will be available on a popular streaming platform or easy to find and rent. I think that makes sense, yeah?
Yeah.
2, each year, I, Arthur, had to have never watched the film before. Part of the reason for doing this whole project was to expose myself to movies that I haven't seen. Andrew, on the other hand, you have seen quite a few of these, yeah?
As of today, I've seen 53% of the films, which means I guess 53 of the films.
But this is an evolving list. It might change. We'll see how it goes. 3, I wanted to choose films from around the world, not just from the Hollywood studios. And although we tried to come up with a diversity of films from a variety of different filmmakers, there are plenty of films that we'll have to skip over, unfortunately. And then 4, every film we chose had to be either relevant to film history or interesting within the context of that time period. I wanted to try and follow history through film and put myself in the shoes of different audiences moving through time. And I wanted to learn more about the progression of filmmaking. So this week we start out with Oscar Micheaux's Within Our Gates, which is known for being the earliest surviving film from an African-American filmmaker. We should mention that Within Our Gates is available to watch through streaming on Criterion Channel, and it is a public domain film, so I think it's available elsewhere.
It is on YouTube as well.
Okay. So you can just find it on YouTube.
Yeah, and I will say the restoration on Criterion Channel does look a little nicer than the one on YouTube.
So in this first part, I want to try and give us some broad and specific historical context. We're recording in 2020, and we're going back literally 100 years to 1920. The Great War had ended in 1918, so there's quite a bit going on, especially in America, post Great War. The Spanish flu is basically considered over. The big pandemic of the century that kills 50 million people is coming to an end. The 19th Amendment is ratified. It's officially ratified in August, so in the U.S., women can officially vote. There's a Red Scare going on in America. There's a lot of fear, in the wake of Russia going communist. There's a terrorist attack. I learned about this in September. Someone bombs Wall Street, an anarchist. It just feels like there's a lot going on in this time period.
Tumultuous year.
The League of Nations is assembled. The United States president at the time, God, I forget his name. Do you have that name?
I do not.
It's Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, yes, of course, Woodrow Wilson, because history told by lightning, of course.
We know that quote.
Right.
So he's putting together the League of Nations along with his allies internationally. And in 1915, Woodrow Wilson was given a screening of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. And he is allegedly quoted saying, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." Which, I don't know about that. Is it possible to talk about this film without talking about Birth of a Nation?
Absolutely not.
when I first came up with this idea for the podcast, I was almost like, if we're going to make it a century, do we want to start in 1915 and start with the birth of a nation? Because here's how I was taught in school. It just feels like there's this a depiction of D.W. Griffith and Birth of a Nation, the first sort of Hollywood blockbuster, as kicking off cinema. Do you feel that way?
So, I first want to ask you, have you seen The Birth of a Nation?
Andrew, I've seen Birth of a Nation, I think, 3 times.
Oh, my Lord.
Like, it's scripture in a lot of film history classes. I remember watching it in high school. I remember watching it in my history of film class. And I remember watching clips of it. I don't think we watched the whole thing, but I remember watching clips of it in, like, an intro to film class. So I feel like I've seen this movie way too many times.
Yeah. I've only seen it once. I have no desire to revisit it.
Right.
I watched Birth of a Nation when I was in high school. And ever since watching it, like, I had the same mentality. Like, this is, regardless of my personal opinions on it, and I'm a big fan of silent film. I'm a big fan of 3-hour plus silent films. I've seen quite a few of them. But for me, it was just a horrible movie. Not just within its content, but, like, it's a very long, boring film. There is a phenomenal sequence, I'm going to give credit where it's due, of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The drama of it, I think, is very, very captivating. And truly, outside of that sequence, I found myself either bored or appalled or a mixture of both for the entire film. But there is this great 15-part documentary called The Story of Film, and he talks about Birth of a Nation very early on, of course. And he shows you how all of these editing techniques and all of these directing techniques and all of these effects and everything that Birth of a Nation is known for being the, like, starting point for, all existed in silent films and short films that had already been released up to that point. And while it's true, like, maybe they weren't all working together to make this 3-hour magnum, ridiculous, long epic, all of those techniques were already in existence and were already being figured out, not just by people in America, but by people all around the world who had started making films at that point. And it does carry historical significance with it. I'm not going to deny the historical significance of The Birth of a Nation. The fact that it's based on a book called The Klansman. The film itself was originally called The Klansman based off the play from 1905 that was also an adaptation of the book. And this whole situation was all based around adapting a book of history that is a very romanticized look at the Ku Klux Klan. Some people, especially like some film historians who do defend Birth of a Nation, will act like it's some sort of like thing that has to go with the time, or there is a certain context you have to give it.
From what I could tell, the Ku Klux Klan had sort of been not like eradicated, but they weren't a powerful group by the like 1870s.
Yeah.
But then once 1915 comes along, they get this beautiful piece of propaganda, essentially, that becomes a rally point where they can use it as a recruiting tool around the country as Birth of a Nation is in cinemas, and it's not like it is today, right, where it's opening weekend, everyone sees it. It's kind of rolled out slowly, and it's still shown year after year as it moves through the country. So from like 1915 to 1920, there's this resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan that can sort of be tied to, I don't want to discredit a lot of the stuff going on in the nation, but this becomes the piece of propaganda that the Ku Klux Klan uses to reignite their terrorist group.
Right. And Thomas Dixon Jr., the author of The Klansman, and also, just for clarity's sake, I have not read The Klansman, don't ever really plan on reading it, but from the knowledge I have of it, it is this hyper nostalgic view of the South, longing for, quote unquote simpler times, and this desire to go back to the way things were. People were reading this book and they were like, oh, I have these same feelings about wanting to, return things back to normal. The book was also released like in 1905. Like, it was in support of segregation 100%. That was the main purpose of this book, and so people were reading it and thinking, oh, well, this book that says all these lovely things that I like and agrees with me on all these things is also talking about how the Ku Klux Klan was essentially the savior of the South, and like the whole reason times were simple then was because of them. So why don't we just get that going again? Like, and that's a very simplified view on it, and I would like to agree with you as well that there were definitely other elements involved, but it was a huge catalyst. It has been considered a huge catalyst by historians for a while. So circling back to Birth of a Nation and the critics who like to say that it's a piece from its time period. Even when it was released, it was already based on very controversial source material, and it was made with the same intentions of the Klansmen, which was to radicalize certain people in the South and to bring back the KKK. Mm-hmm. There are other films from that time period that you can learn that same history from. You can learn, this is how this technique came forward. This is how we discovered these editing techniques. This is how we discovered colorizing whole film reels to represent flashbacks and stuff. Like, these are the films that are responsible for that. And you don't have to force a bunch of students to sit through KKK propaganda for it. And I think there are silent films you can show people that will spark their interest in silent film and will make them think, oh, there's more to this than I'd ever expected. And I don't think Birth of a Nation is one of those movies.
No. So we should stop talking about Birth of a Nation.
Agreed.
And we should talk about Oscar Micheaux's reaction to Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith, and the climate of the racial culture in America during the 1919-1920 sort of era.
Yeah, it's a huge year. I mean, this was a movie that came out right at the beginning too. It's crazy that this sort of kicked off the year, even though it was originally slated to be released in the December of the year prior.
Which is why the context of the 1919 race riots feel so relevant to talk about.
Absolutely, yes. The main thing I looked into was the Chicago race riot. Large groups of white, they didn't call themselves the Ku Klux Klan, but this was in the North and the South, were going through and murdering black people and burning down their houses and leaving people homeless. And then these black people had no homes, no way to really recover from it. The government definitely wasn't doing anything to help them. It just culminated in these riots within Chicago. It was just black people fighting back for their basic rights and to be treated as basic humans. Yeah, that was also a controversial point for this film being released, because there were censors who didn't want the film to be released because they thought it would instigate further violence, even though, this is all a reaction to way more horrible violence being done on the black people initially.
Mm-hmm. The end of the war brings a lot of soldiers back from Europe, and there's this hyper competition for jobs. And as more black people had been traveling from the south into the north part of the country, because agriculture was kind of drying up and there were more opportunities in the industrial north, even though the south is usually looked at as the hyper-racist sort of Ku Klux Klan dominated area of the country. The riots that are taking place are in, like you said, cities like Chicago.
Yeah, and even the opening intertitle of the film is, talking about how this film takes place in the North, which is not quite as regressive as the South, but where the occasional lynching still happens. That's the tone setter of the whole movie.
Yeah, and I was curious how to read that intertitle. Was that an incredibly dark joke? How did you read that?
I read it as just being very straightforward with the audience. And I have the context of knowing this is the earliest film we still have that hasn't been lost, directed by a black filmmaker. So, of course, for me, I'm seeing it as a black filmmaker looking through the screen and saying, hey, it's not just the South, it's the North, too. They might not have these crazy laws that are still in place in the South, and they might not have the quote-unquote Ku Klux Klan, but there are still lynchings happening. There's still this huge division, and there's this huge inequality issue between the races, and and so that was how I read it. I can see how, like, within the film, it does have a sort of dark, humorous tint to it, almost. But I did not read it that way when I was initially watching the film. I just took it as here's the tone. We're in America. No matter where you go, horrible things are happening to black people. And he has actually denied that it was a reaction to Birth of a Nation. There's definitely no way that he hadn't seen Birth of a Nation at that point, considering his position in the movie-making industry and the culture surrounding cinema. Mm-hmm. So I think it being a reaction to it could have been considered even a subconscious situation. Mm-hmm. But I just felt like that needed to be stated, that he has... And I also think that was him trying to sort of distance it from it a little bit. Yeah. But yeah, within our gates, opposite side of the spectrum of silent film.
Before we get into our opinions, we should try to summarize some synopsis of this film, which I will admit is kind of hard.
Yeah. Crazy narrative flashbacks within flashbacks. Yeah. It's very interesting, but I'm more than willing to give it a go.
I'll try to start out. It's an ensemble cast, right? It's a lot of characters, and there's a lot of moving pieces. But I think the one person we want to kind of focus on is Sylvia.
Yeah, Sylvia Landry.
She and her cousin Alma are in the North. They are talking about Conrad, who Sylvia is going to marry. But Alma loves Conrad, so we got this love triangle going on.
Yeah.
And she kind of sabotages their relationship. In the meantime, Alma's stepbrother, Larry, he's this gambler who gets into trouble. He ends up killing this professional poker player. The beginning of the first act of this film just feels like this sort of tangled melodrama.
At first, I wasn't sure whether it was going to just be, because I'd never seen the film or heard about it before, I wasn't sure if it was going to be separate scenes that were just sort of presenting a overview of the North. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, things started to tie together and characters started to know each other, and the narrative began to unfold.
So, moving forward, Sylvia meets Reverend Jacobs, who is a minister who runs a school for black children called Pineywood School. But it's running out of money, and Sylvia takes it upon herself to find money to keep this Pineywood School afloat. So she goes and she ends up finding this white philanthropist, and she can convince her to donate $5,000 to keep Pineywood's school going.
And I do want to just interject that woman offers her the money because Sylvia is trying to save a kid in the middle of the street from getting run over by a car, and gets run over by the car instead. And the woman who runs her over is like, oh my gosh, I am so sorry. And Sylvia's been going from place to place saying, hey, we need money for the school. And the woman's like, anything I can do to compensate you. I feel so bad about running you over with my car. And she says, well, I need $5,000 for the school. And the woman's like, perfect. That sounds reasonable to me.
I had forgotten that, because what distracted me, it feels like there's these tangents the film goes on, right? That Oscar Micheaux's sort of just kind of exploring an environment, an ecosystem of people, more so than a direct story. Because that philanthropist is talking with her white friend, another white rich woman, who tells her, oh, don't give that money to the school. You should just give it to this preacher, Ned, right?
Oh, I totally thought the woman wasn't going to give her the money because of that.
Right?
Yeah, they got me. I was like, oh, no. But then, of course, she's like, you know what? I don't agree with your opinions, and I'm going to give $50,000 to the school now. Which is, feels like a very optimistic point of view from Oscar Micheaux.
I think the most interesting part of the film would be the third act flashback.
Right. So Alma ends up going and talking to this other man who was fallen for, he's a doctor, I can't remember his name, but he's also fallen for Sylvia. And she explains Sylvia's whole backstory to him, to give him context, which involves her entire family, her adopted parents being lynched by a mob after a disagreement with a landlord. Her little brother gets shot, but he's able to run away, and she is almost raped by the man who, in the midst of attempting to rape her, discovers from a scar on her chest that she is his biological child. And yeah, it's a very, very visceral flashback. And then the doctor finds Sylvia, and he's like, I understand you have a hard past, but there is future, there is hope in America, and we just have to keep going forward, and I would like to go forward with you. And then they get married.
Yeah, it has a very almost like Hollywood ending, doesn't it?
Yeah, it takes a very, very dark turn, and then the last 5 minutes, the flashback ends, and it's like, I think it's maybe 4 or 5 more shots for the rest of the movie of just like, you know what, everything's gonna be okay.
Yeah, which I was shocked by, especially given the way that flashback in the third act was going, and like you said, it's not easy to watch.
The whole lynching happens because the landlord has a disagreement with her father, and then white man who has some sort of debt or something with him. I don't know. That part was a little unclear, but a white man comes in and kills their landlord. And the black man who works for the landlord, who is trying to essentially be on the white people's side here, and like
he's sort of the Uncle Tom stereotype.
He wants to be befriended by them, and he's doing this for his survival, so I'm going to give that credit. Mm-hmm. But Oscar Micheaux is not a fan of this guy. It's made very clear in the film, in the way he's performed. So he says, oh, it was that black man who came in and had the argument with him, who came in and shot him, and that's what catalyst into the lynching. And then that black man, what was his name? I think his name was, Ephraim. But Ephraim, the film visually prepares you for a lynching scene, because Ephraim, when he sees the mob starting to congregate, has this vision in his head where it's a composite shot of him looking terrified with a rope that it looks like he's in a noose. And that's like his nightmare. It's like a 5-second nightmare. And then when he realizes, oh, that could be my potential future, I gotta get good with the mob, and then he befriends the mob, and then they are unsuccessful in their initial attempt to lynch the parents because they run away into a swamp. And so they're like, well, we have to lynch someone, and they lynch him. And it's horrible.
It's dark.
It feels like a message that he's giving to his fellow black people, saying, if you are siding with the white people, and if you are saying, if you are helping them out in these horrible racist attacks, and if you are helping them out in their violence against black people, don't get comfortable, because they don't see you as any different than somebody else.
Yeah, so your impression of the story overall, I can tell you that I feel like, even though it's messy, it has an ensemble cast that is kind of all over the place and goes in tangents, I still felt drawn in throughout the whole film. I was still interested throughout the whole film. So even though it's not a traditional sort of story structure, it feels like it still worked.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. As soon as it started, I was pretty much immediately drawn in. Alma and Sylvia and the doctor were all characters that stuck out to me immediately. I thought they developed them well. And I thought that the flashback sequence was a really actually kind of genius way to fold that narrative, because the story sort of hits a stopping point of like, okay, things have mostly worked out. The school's been paid for. The relationships are starting to fall into a nice, tidy place. Mm-hmm. And then, and the doctor and Alma come together to have this conversation. And in your mind, having seen other movies, you think, oh, they're going to come together and she's going to be like, go with him so I can be with this guy we're both in love with. And that's going to be it. But then she starts delving into this backstory, and he just takes full advantage of the opportunity to like depict this horrific personal imagery that he very obviously feels very passionate to portray on screen from a black man. So that is sort of where the response to the other film comes into my mind.
Yeah, because a lot of the same imagery is depicted in Birth of a Nation. Like you said, it's telling that the censors went after this film and not Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lynching, attempted rape, murder, like it's all there, and it's being depicted from a more honest, non-oppressive viewpoint.
Absolutely. I would not say I was bored at all during the film. There were definitely full scenes where I was completely confused, especially near the beginning. And there is a middle section of the film that is straight up missing, where they just have words on the screen saying, this is what happened during this scene. And those intertitles, even though I think they were written like in the 70s or 80s, they do not, I don't think they get across the story very well. When that part happened, and of course, I've seen that happen in so many other movies. There's so many films from that period where there are whole scenes where it's just writing on the screen saying, this is what happened during this part.
Trust us.
Yeah. And for the most part, I feel like when that happens, I'm able to still follow it pretty well. But with that specific intertitle, it only confused me more. I can't even remember what it said. Those are like my main criticisms of the narrative. All of that aside, I found it a very entertaining, energetic film. There's always a drive.
Yeah.
And I will always appreciate that, especially in silent film, when you couldn't quick edit between motion and stuff, and the camera was stagnant the whole time. To be able to create that sort of momentum within your film. No easy feat back then. And Oscar Micheaux does it with delicacy and grace, I would say.
I'm glad you brought up the intertitles that say that there's a scene missing. Because for a while it was lost.
Yes.
It was no one believed this film still existed. But then in 1993, in a Spanish film archive, it was sort of rediscovered. But all the intertitles were still in Spanish, right?
Yes, they had to translate those intertitles from Spanish to English.
It's weird to think that the movie that we're watching is sort of a reinterpretation of another reinterpretation of the original film that was censored and that has a scene missing. Like it's like a Ship of Theseus sort of situation, yeah?
It's even crazier to think about this is his second film. And his first film, The Homesteader, which came out the previous year, it was early 1919, is lost. And that's based on an autobiographical book that he wrote.
So he had the Micheaux Book and Film Company. It was his own company. It's like an independent film company where he's using it to distribute his novels and his films. And
he released 2 more films that year in 1920.
How do people make so many films? I don't understand that.
One of them is available. I haven't watched it. The Symbol of the Unconquered, and then The Brute is a lost film. The major thing about The Brute is that it depicts a boxing match where a black man defeats a white rival. And even if we were to find that movie in Argentina or Brazil or wherever we're finding film prints today, that scene would not be included because the censors forced him to get rid of it and it was destroyed.
Wow.
So like just a scene, like the fragility, you know what I mean? Like
just trying to find films to watch throughout the 1920s. I would find things that'd be like, oh, that sounds cool. I'm excited about that. And then you're like, no, it doesn't exist. It's gone. Yeah.
It's a miracle though that we do have film from this period. At the time, film was not seen as any sort of a permanent thing. It was kind of seen as theater or as like a carnival show, like you would have it playing at your Nickelodeon. It would be projected for a week or two or whatever, and then it was disposed of. And there were very few films that they actually did hang on to. I think that there was, obviously, you had the, oh my gosh, I can't even believe it. The father of special effects.
George Méliès?
Yes, yeah. You had his whole approach, which was this should be for everyone, and he would just play them. Which, you still had to pay an entrance fee for the carnival and stuff, but you would just walk into the booth and the movie would be playing. But that's another reason why so many of his shorts are so well preserved, is because he personally was holding on to them so that he could show them at the next show, because he saw that as like sort of a cheap way to keep people entertained. Today's perspective on film as being this medium that we should preserve, and that we should, release in a way that people can watch it at home, and constantly being able to spread that information. That just was not the mentality in the time period. It really was like theater. It was like you'd go and you'd see it, and if you got a chance to go see it again, good for you. But if not, you saw it, and you paid your weekly paycheck for it, pretty much, and then it would just go away, and then the next one would come in, and that all ties into the history of serials.
One of the things I want to look at for each of the films as we move from year to year is what felt outdated and what felt ahead of its time. So within our gates, what was outdated, what was ahead of its time?
Well, ahead of its time for me, I take this moment to delve into the film's perspective on religion.
Okay, yes.
So we get this sequence. I don't even think we mentioned that at this point the film is in the South. After the love triangle sort of doesn't work out and she goes to help the school is in the South, and the fundraising and stuff all takes place in the South. And I do think that's right. And I do think that's important to mention for this church sequence, because it is very heavily rooted in a Southern Baptist traditional service. The white woman who tells the other white woman, don't give that school your money. The black people are totally fine, just being dumb and just hanging on to religion. And that's how they want to live. This is this white woman's perspective. Mm-hmm. And we flash to the church, all black church, being led by a black preacher. And it's a very energetic service where this black preacher is riling up his congregation, saying that the white people will all go to hell, and black people are the only people that will ascend to heaven, just telling them all of this good stuff that they want to hear, raising them up, and then asking for all of their money. And it's made very clear throughout this whole film up to this point, very well contextualized, that the black people do not have any money. Like, everyone is poor, pretty much, in the South. And they're giving, like, what little money they have into this offering plate. We follow the preacher after the service, where he goes and talks to a group of white men, and it turns out he's just in their pockets. And all of this he's saying is to sort of subdue the black people and make them feel peaceful. It was just, watching it blew my mind, just to have such a pessimistic view on churches in that time period and what their actual motivations were. It just feels like this one safe haven these black people think they have, even this one safe haven, is controlled and run by white people who just want them suppressed and want them to be quiet. And the black preacher is, again, another character who Oscar Micheaux does not seem to be a big fan of, because we see him get kicked around and stuff, and he just takes it like it's no big deal.
It's a scathing depiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't think he wants to write off all of religion. I mean, he has Reverend Jacobs is the minister who runs the Pineywood School,
Yeah, that's true.
So in his world, there's clearly a good way to be religious and a cynical, exploitative way.
For me, I guess the film doesn't ever say this out loud, but with the context given around the sequence, and when that intertitle came up of make sure you give the Lord all your money, I was like, oh man. And he's made such a big point about how no one has any money.
It's even more it's clearly important for Micheaux, because it's one of those tangents in the film that you could cut all of the preacher. I think it's preacher Ned. I think you could cut all of his scenes and the film would still work. So it's clearly important for Micheaux. He's like, I don't care that this doesn't help the story. I'm going to spend a good amount of time looking into this. I do want to just give this for context, that I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up in Alabama. I grew up in a neighborhood where it was me and one other white family. And besides that, it was all black people who lived in our neighborhood. I loved it. I had a great time growing up there. And I went to a Southern Baptist church. To see a criticism like that against a Southern Baptist church, which in my eyes are still, I don't think the insidious
racial prerogative is there now, but I do think that they do take advantage of their congregation, and they do take advantage of tithing to a certain extent. And I would like to confirm, that the even the church I attended, always did great things for the community. It was a great way to meet people. If there was a tornado, if there was any sort of disaster, I mean, even when Katrina hit, people got to sleep there. They did a lot of great things for the community, and I would never want to discredit that.
But Oscar Micheaux clearly has some thoughts.
But I had actually forgotten, because he's in the film so little, I'd forgotten that the person who's heading up the school is a reverend as well. I had completely forgotten about that. So that detail I think is very important to note. And so for this film to have such a nuanced approach to that, I think is way ahead of its time. Outdated? It's hard for me to think of that within this film, honestly.
That's hard too, because the entire film's outdated just because it was made in 1920.
Right. Every shot is completely stagnant, Yeah. I actually think that if you were to show somebody who was in high school or something and that they had already seen Birth of a Nation because they were in a film class or whatever, I think if you showed them Within Our Gates, their mind would be blown by how progressive it feels in comparison.
Yeah.
It has a very progressive energy to it. Clearly... Well, actually, I don't even know where I'm going to go with that, so never mind.
I was going to say, I don't want to say anything's behind its time in this movie. The language of cinema has come such a long way since then, and it was interesting to just sit there and kind of take that in, because they're still treating it like a theater. It's still like this. There's 3 walls, and the 4th wall is basically where they imagine the audience watching the film, right?
Yes.
Filmmakers back in this time period didn't seem like they were thinking of the space in a 3-dimensional cinematic way. It still felt like a reinterpretation of theater. That's kind of what stuck out to me, but it's not any sort of slight against the film.
Yeah, I would agree. And, it's one thing I was reading about was the criticisms against Oscar Micheaux coming across as not as artistic, being a more economic filmmaker, I guess is the way to phrase it.
Oh, what does that mean?
Being someone who pretty much wants to tell the story, isn't going to give a lot of flair, isn't going to give a lot of flash or substance to it. And this isn't my opinion. This is things he was criticized for as a filmmaker during his career. But I think of the lighting. I mean, during the swamp sequence, when you see the family escaping through there, and the high contrast between the light shimmering off of the water versus the dark forest that they emerge from to go into that water. I mean, I have seen quite a few silent films. I definitely wouldn't call myself an expert on it, but I've seen quite a few. And I found the film to be actually quite vivid and beautiful. There are some silent films you watch and you're like, this person has no idea, the dynamics of a camera.
But you did not, but not this film. You didn't feel that here.
Absolutely not. I actually, I was very impressed with, even though a lot of the spaces looked very similar, just the way that he would frame them and the way people would talk in them and stuff sort of did make them feel separate. I am 100% convinced that that house that the love triangle takes place in and the house that the doctor is working in are the exact same set. I am 100% convinced that they are just the same building.
Again, you know what? That's independent filmmaking. That's
right.
Okay.
I was just going to say, this is his independent production company, and there are a lot of set pieces in this,
Yeah, I was going to say the ahead of its time aspect of it, even though this feels like it has a optimistic sort of Hollywood ending, the meandering nature of the plot felt like something that I have not seen from other silent films, which are a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more, Hollywood 3-act structure. The fact that this is just an exploration of an ensemble cast and the ecosystem that they're living in that felt kind of like an innovative way to tell a story.
Yeah, I would completely agree.
All right. In this next section, I want to look up a review from the time period or some piece of marketing. So, what were people saying about Within Our Gates back when it first premiered? I think that's kind of fun. Yeah. So we found a review from the Chicago Defender.
It was published January 24th, 1920. So this is actually the piece of literature that exists that kind of gives it the historical context of it being censored.
So the exact quote is, "This is the picture that it required 2 solid months to get by the censor board."
Right. And that was meant as a jab. That was them publicly criticizing the censorship board because they were pretty much saying, this doesn't really make any sense that this film took so long to get released and had to go through all of this.
Continuing the quote from the Chicago Defender, and it is the claim of the author and producer that, while it is a bit radical, is with the biggest protest against race, prejudice, lynching, and concubinage that was ever written or filmed, and that there are more thrills and gripping holding moments than was ever seen in any individual production. I do love the hyperbole sometimes of film marketing from this era.
Yeah. The poster is so good. It's a story of the race with an all-star colored cast featuring Evelyn Prier and other capable artists. It will hold you spellbound, grit your teeth in silent indignation.
Ooh, that's pretty good.
Grit your teeth in silent indignation. It's like...
That's so good.
Yeah, you some posters would tell you like, oh, you'll look in awe, you'll scream, you'll jump, and this one's like, you are going to sit there and be pissed about this situation, and you are going to be angry about this whole situation.
Look at this. Adults 30 cents, children 15 cents, so you can bring the kids.
There isn't a lot of opinion in the review, I will say that.
There is one piece, there's like one sentence of opinion. People interested in the welfare of the race cannot afford to miss seeing this great production. And remember, it tells it all. They liked it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can tell even from... I mean, because they were being public about the censorship and about Oscar Micheaux because his film had just been released the previous year and was marketed as an all-black cast. So from the very beginning, Oscar Micheaux was being very public that like a huge advertising ploy of the film was this can be all black people in a movie. You will see yourself on screen, Right. And it's crazy that even still exists today.
It is. It's so weird. There's a black. You can't do blackface now, but you can still do brownface.
Yeah.
You can still do like subtle yellow face.
Yep.
I've seen it.
And and even just like the idea of an all black cast in a movie is still something to be like you get lauded for, Like
that's what you meant. That's true. Yeah.
It's definitely still not as common within Hollywood and within big Hollywood studios, directed and written by black people and all black casts.
Right.
I mean, I loved the film, but even Last Black Man in San Francisco, which came out last year, which is predominantly black cast, directed and written by a white man who was very close friends with the main character in real life, and the actor who was the main character is playing himself in the movie. So I'm not discrediting the film for that, but I'm just saying that was a film that was released to high praise and was released by a prestigious studio, A24, last year, all black cast. And even that film is produced, directed, and written by white people. So it's hard, but it's pretty much it's hard to like even talk about that subject really because there's so much nuance. And I again truly don't want to discredit an artist.
Yeah, because Last Black Man in San Francisco is a fantastic film.
Yeah, very very good movie. But in 1919, because I'm talking of The Homesteader right now. The fact that film written, directed, produced by a black man starring an all-black cast, that advertising it would still be considered like something to remark upon, you know?
Because the sad thing is that even though we've been talking about Within Our Gates for a bit of time, it is a film that you can, I feel like you can keep exploring and go down rabbit holes, because Oscar Micheaux's whole career is pretty fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of something you have to go seek out for yourself. Like
and that is a shame. He truly should be taught. Yeah.
He was pioneering a lot of tactics and filmmaking that would go on to, become independent filmmaking. Sort of this film industry outside of Hollywood.
And there was one independent black studio. Lincoln Motion Picture Company was the first movie company owned and controlled by black filmmakers. They did not last very long. All of their films before Oscar Micheaux anyways, are lost. So he wasn't the first, but he's the earliest we have access to.
Right.
And I think even that is so important to teach, if I'm being honest, if I were to just based off completely off of even my own self-studies and like what I was taught in high school and college, I didn't even really think there were a lot of black filmmakers around at that time. And so it was a huge eye-opener for me to watch this film and to learn about this man who's, kind of an unspoken pioneer in film.
Full disclosure for anyone who couldn't tell, but we're two white dudes talking about black culture in the 1920s, so we don't know what we're talking about.
Right.
And it's just pretty cool to do, our own research, look into it, and discover this whole world that wasn't taught in the traditional sense.
Again, I cannot stress enough how much better of a movie Within Our Gates is than The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation is a chore. Within Our Gates, I legitimately enjoyed.
Yeah.
I still wouldn't put it on the list of films that I think could introduce people to silent film, because the plot is a little frayed, it's a little confusing at times, and there are just certain quirks that you sort of adjust to with silent cinema that this film is chock full of. But I definitely think if you are someone who is looking into film history and is trying to get more into silent film, this is a great movie. It's one of my new favorite silent films, honestly. Very happy I got a chance to watch it.
I still feel like I'm kind of new to silent film. I'm a fan of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, just because I can laugh at them.
Yeah.
But it's hard for me to get invested in silent film stories, even though, as a filmmaker, I appreciate the sort of raw cinematic language that comes from silent films. When we get to Metropolis, I feel like that's like in full force. Like, it feels cinematic and grand and epic.
Oh yeah.
So, Within Our Gates, I hate rating things. Let's just not rate it.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to rate it. I haven't rated a movie since I was in 9th grade, and I surely didn't know what I was talking about then.
What are we watching next week?
So next week's film is The Phantom Carriage, a very famous silent film known for its special effects and haunting narrative. So I have seen this one before. The director of this film plays the main character in Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries. When I found out he had directed this film that's considered like one of the main pioneers of silent film as far as narrative and special effects were concerned, I was like, oh, okay, I should watch this. It is a very dark movie.
Darkly lit, or?
It's a very dark narrative. I'm not going to go into it too deeply. Yeah, no spoilers yet. We'll wait for the beginning of next week's podcast for that.
Where can people watch The Phantom Carriage?
So it's on the Criterion channel.
Very good. If we are treating this like a book club where you're keeping up week by week, probably a good idea to subscribe to the Criterion channel. I feel like so many of the films, especially these early films, are going to be available there.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce the director's name? Victor?
Oh, you want me to do that right now?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Sjöström? I would guess Sjöström. We'll say it right next week when we do our research.
Okay. It could be anything. So
It could be anything.
I just want to give a shout out to all our Patreon members who keep the show running. Thank you all. You too can become a patron and get access to bonus episodes linked down in the show notes. You're listening on YouTube now, so like and subscribe and comment down below. Tell us if you've seen the film. What did you think of it? Did we miss anything? Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you for the next one.